All right. Hello, I'm Isabella, and my project is on brain function and anatomy. So, some of the content that we're going to be going over in this slideshow is the basic anatomy and functions of the regions of the brain. The regions that we're going to be talking about are the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the midbrain, the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla. So we're also going to understand the lobes of the cerebrum. We're going to describe the layers of the meninges, which are the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and pia mater. And lastly, we're going to discuss the function of cerebral spinal fluid. These functions include production, circulation, and reabsorption. So to start off, we're going to look at the regions of the brain and their locations. So here I have a diagram of the brain, and it's labeled with the names of all the regions. So to begin, let's look at the diencephalon. We follow the arrow to the diencephalon, we'll see that it's located right around here. Now in the diencephalon, we can also find the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Now the hypothalamus is highlighted orange and the thalamus is highlighted green right here. And they are located, like I mentioned, in the diencephalon. We also have the cerebrum, which generally is this area. It's the largest area of the brain. Next, we'll have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. These three right here make up the brain stem. So the midbrain is here, this light blue area. Pons is this pink area, and the medulla is at the very bottom at this purple area. Lastly, we have these three sections. We have the cerebral cortex, which is right here, the arbor vitae, which is located right around here, and all of this can be found in the cerebellum, which is this general area right here. All right, now we're going to dive a little bit more in depth on the regions of the brain. So to begin, we're going to briefly cover the cerebrum. We'll talk more in depth about the cerebrum on later slides. But for right now, it's the largest part of the human brain, and it is separated into 4 lobes. So we'll cover that more later. Next, we have the diencephalon, which I showed on the previous slide. It connects the cerebrum to the rest of the nervous system. In the diencephalon, you can find the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So the thalamus relays information from the brainstem and it processes it. This includes all sensory information but smell. The hypothalamus is involved in the regulation of homeostasis and is in charge of the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system. The next section we're going to talk about is the midbrain. So the midbrain, part of the brainstem, it coordinates sensory representations of visual, auditory, and somatosensory spaces. The visual reflex center is also found in the midbrain. Our next section is the cerebellum. So we're moving out of the brainstem momentarily. The cerebellum is also referred to as the little brain. So the cerebellum compares information from the cerebrum with sensory feedback from the periphery. So in the cerebellum, we have the cerebellar cortex and the arbor vitae. So the cerebellar cortex is an outer layer of cerebellum which is made of gray matter. And the arbor vitae is the intersection of white matter. It's called arbor vitae because the formation of it seems to represent a tree. Overall, the cerebellum fine-tunes motor commands and assists in coordination. Next, we're going to discuss our last two sections of the brain and the last two sections of the brain stem. So, we have the pons, which connects the cerebellum and the brain stem together. This assists in regulating the cardiovascular and respiratory systems. It's a thick bundle made of white matter, and as I mentioned, it is part of the brain stem. The medulla connects the brain and the spinal cord. This contains pyramidal tracts that send motor signals from the motor cortex down into the spinal cord. This assists in regulating the cardiovascular and respiratory systems as well. These two, the medulla and the pons, work together to regulate these two systems. As it says, the medulla is also part of the brain stem. Next, we're going to talk about the cerebrum. We're going to dive a little bit more in depth on the cerebrum. So to begin, I have another diagram here with different sections of the cerebrum indicated. So first, we'll talk about the cerebral cortex. Now, the cerebral cortex is the general outermost wrinkled portion of the cerebrum, all these little wrinkles here, and it's made of gray matter. Now, the cerebrum has two hemispheres called the cerebral hemispheres, which are separated by the longitudinal fissure. They make up left and right hemispheres. Right now, we have the right hemisphere being depicted. This dotted line right here indicates where the longitudinal fissure would be. This is just a large division between the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. So it cuts it down right in the middle. So now we're going to talk about the lobes of the cerebrum. So to start, we'll talk about the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe, which is right here, this pink area, is the frontal lobe. It is the primary motor cortex and it instructs cells to move skeletal muscles. So it's in charge of planned movement, and the anterior section has some cognitive functions like personality, short-term memory, and consciousness. Next, we'll discuss the temporal lobe, which is this dark purple area right here. So the temporal lobe is the primary auditory sensation center. It's also responsible for memory and helps establish long-term memory. We have the parietal lobe as well, which is this lighter purple area, gray area right here. So the parietal lobe is also the primary somatosensory cortex. So this is the location of the processing of all tactile senses. Next, we have the occipital lobe. This is our final lobe in the brain. It's this little green area right here. It is in charge of visual processing. So this is also the primary visual cortex. This is where all visual stimuli get processed. Additionally, we have some gyrus, which are all these little wrinkles in the sections of the brain. So Sulcus are the grooves between the two gyri, and gyri is just gyrus but plural, and that's the little lines in between the ridges or grooves. Next, we're going to talk about the meninges. So we've heard about the meninges before. The meninges can be found in the spinal cord as well, but in the brain, it's going to be this little layer right here that protects the brain. So right here, I've outlined a section where you could be able to find the layers of the meninges, and we've blown it up for better visual right here. So let's start with the dura mater. So the dura mater is this blue layer right here. It is a thick fibrous layer and it forms a protective sheath over the brain. Underneath the dura mater is the arachnoid mater. So that's this pink layer right here. And that is a thin fibrous layer and it forms a loose sac around the central nervous system. The next layer is the pia mater. Now the pia mater is this dark purple line right here that separates the brain from the arachnoid space right here. This is a thin fibrous membrane. It's the space of the innermost layer of the central nervous system. Now, another term we have mentioned here is arachnoid granulations, which we'll see better on the next slide, but they can be found in the subarachnoid space right here. They are small one-way valves that allow cerebrospinal fluid to flow from the subarachnoid space to the dural space, and we'll see why that's important in this next slide. So, on our last slide, we're going to be talking about cerebrospinal fluid. Now, cerebrospinal fluid flows through the central nervous system, is produced by filtration of the blood by the choroid plexus. Now, the choroid plexus can be found right around here. Cerebrospinal fluid is circulated by 4 ventricles. So, we have the lateral ventricles. These are located deep within the cerebellum. There are 2 of them. Right here, since this is the right side of the brain, or the right hemisphere, we have the right lateral ventricle, somewhere in here. Then we have the third ventricle, which is connected by 2 openings, and it passes through the left and right diencephalon. So here we have the third ventricle, the left to the right. Our last ventricle is the fourth ventricle, and this is the space between the cerebellum and the brainstem. So this is where cerebrospinal fluid is able to flow into the subarachnoid space. So as we mentioned earlier in the previous slide, the granules are what allow the cerebrospinal fluid to flow into the subarachnoid space. So here we have the arachnoid granulations, and there are these little nodules right here, and we can see that from the fourth ventricle right here, the blood flows out, or the fluid flows out, and it goes into the subarachnoid space. And it goes this way as well.